Hey, I'm Dara, and in today's episode, I want to talk about why we should all stop reading bad news. And despite my prop here, this is even more the case for things we read online. So let's begin. Concretely, I want to cover three things. Let me just put my papers away. Number one, I want to cover why we should stop reading the news. And I'm also going to share some research on that. Number two, I'm going to talk about the conscious media diet that I've started. And this is an experiment that I've done for 5 years. So, there's quite a lot of experience behind that. And number three, I'm just going to give you a recommendation that you can use to limit the impact of bad news in your life. So with that being said, let's jump right in. Why should we stop reading bad news? Well, turns out bad news is bad news for you. There's a 1997 study, for instance, that looked at the impact of people who read negative news bulletins. And those who read negative ones versus those who read neutral ones or positive ones were more likely to worry and to catastrophize and so on and so forth. So clearly there's an impact of bad news. And interestingly enough, though, bad news are really popular. There was, for instance, like a study that looked at U.S. preference when it comes to the news. And news about terrorism is consistently at the top. Even though if you look at what actually takes lives, there's a lot of stuff that has, like a bigger impact on the average American's life expectancy than terrorism. And what's also interesting is that people tend to say that they want to read less negative news and more positive ones. But when scientists did an experiment where they tracked where people naturally clicked, they actually clicked on the negative news, not the positive ones. So even though we may say, hey, I want to read positive news, chances are, no, we probably don't. And from our history, it actually makes sense. Because what's more likely to get you killed? Is it not knowing about the tiger? Or is it having missed, like the positive news that your third cousin's best friend had a baby? Probably not knowing about the tiger, right? So I think that's basically where our preference for negative news comes from. Now, people like to think that reading negative news keeps them informed. But actually, that's really debatable, especially if we read online news, which is very quickly produced. There's not a lot of research that goes into it. Often it basically just reads like a repeat of, like some press release or something like that. So I'm definitely not talking about great investigative journalism, well-researched, well-rounded pieces. I'm not talking about that. That is really important, and I think we should all, support that level of journalism. I'm talking about the fast food version of journalism that we've been on. I'm talking about a conscious media diet in a bit. We've been on the fast food media diet. All right, so one thing is that the breaking news of the day typically isn't really placed in the right context. So I want to give you an example. And you can read a bit more about in my super long article that I wrote about my 5-year experiments with stopping to read the news. Nowadays, we think of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand as what triggered World War I and, had such a huge impact on the history of the 20th century. But if you actually look at newspapers of, that day when the news came out, they didn't foresee that at all. So you could have read the news and still you wouldn't have been any wiser. So that's just an example of how breaking news are typically not placed in the larger historical context. It's often, shooting from the hips or incomplete or something like that. The other thing that misinforms us about negative news is that we often miss a lot of positive news. And that's really what I learned when I started my conscious media experiment. So conscious media diet experiment. So let me move on to point number 2, the conscious media diet. So at some point a couple years ago, I got so fed up by the impact that news had on me that I started a conscious media diet experiment. Basically, the rules of this were the following. Number 1, read less negative news. Number 2, read more positive news. Number 3, see what happens. So, want to know what happened? What happened is that my mood increased drastically. And I wasn't an unhappy individual then. Like I did mindfulness and meditation and a lot of the things that are typically seen as being good for our general mood. I was in a good relationship, I liked my parents, I liked my friends, and still, not reading that much negative news had such a drastic impact on my overall mood. It was really quite profound. And I didn't change anything else in my life at the time, so I can only, I can only attribute that to the shifts in my media news. I also realized that I was actually getting misinformed by reading so many negative news, because the thing is, there's so many positive news that don't really get a lot of airtime. So because I was deliberately seeking out positive news to read, I, paid a lot of attention to the positive developments. And that reminds me of this quote by Bill Gates. It went somewhere along the lines that newspaper headlines are misleading because negative news is a headline, but gradual positive development isn't. And that's, I'm paraphrasing, but that was sort of like the gist of that quote. And I really learned that through my conscious media experiment, that there was so much that I was missing and that people in general are missing because they're so focused on, negative news. And yeah, so those were some of the results with my conscious media diet experiment. And I also realized that people loved it when I, saw some positive headlines and I shared them with them. There's one danger, though, with positive news, and the danger is that if you go to some of the Good News website, you'll notice that a lot of the stories they share are basically individual acts of kindness. And that's really lovely, right? I mean, we all want to hear stories about how firefighters rescued kittens, or somebody helped an elderly woman carry the groceries, or whatever that is. However, those individual acts of kindness don't really change big structural problems. So what I was sometimes missing in the Good News websites was, more information about positive structural developments, like laws that were changed to give people better protection, more rights, or things like that. So I think that's sort of like the one danger, that, good news, positive news can sometimes hide differences in opinion, because not everybody's going to have the same opinion about what's a positive development, right? So I just wanted to mention that too. So with that being said, let's move to point number 3, my recommendations for you. So what I would recommend is for you to just see, how reading the news or watching the news make you feel, and if there's something you want to change about that. If you notice that there's something that you want to change about that, it really helps to remove triggers in your environment. So that includes, removing notifications from your phone. It can also help to just pick a couple of news sources that you trust and that are well researched, that you're going to look at. It can, despite me holding up, like a printed out newspaper initially, they're actually much better than reading news online, because here's the thing. In a print newspaper, you only have a limited amount of space. So you're not just going to create, journalists are not going to create article after article after article about the same issue without hardly any new information at all. So in general, in a print newspaper, you're going to have higher quality information. So, one idea might be to switch from online to print newspapers. Or you could switch to some news aggregators, where they give you the top news stories of the week. Or you can ask somebody what's going on and then do some research if you think something's so important that you want to really get to the bottom of it. I'd also recommend that you start reading some positive news, especially if you read about tragedies. It can be really helpful to see if there is some positive stuff that's connected to it. So, for instance, as I shared in my article, I had once, read about a terror attack and was obviously sort of feeling the impact of that and the human lives lost and how terrible all that was, and that people do that to others. And I didn't just want to stick with that feeling as sort of the takeaway, depression about humanity. So what I found were some wonderful stories about how there were so many volunteers who rushed to donate blood and to really help, the people affected by that. And that rounded the negative news, because in negative news, it was absolutely true. It was true, that people's lives were lost. And it was also true that there were people who really wanted to help out and that there was sort of an outpouring of generosity. And by looking at both of these together, I got a fuller picture of what's actually going on. And that's really what this conscious media diet is about, to get a fuller picture of what's going on. It's not to turn away from the negative. It's just to, balance shadow and light, if we want to, or darkness and light, if we want to think about it in those terms. So those are my recommendations for you. If you liked this and would like to, hear more thoughts on how to live the best life possible, please hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next episode.